Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
A revised FAR proposal now out for comment aims to unify how civilian agencies define and safeguard controlled, unclassified information in contracts, reflecting industry pushback on earlier drafts while addressing long-standing gaps that left contractors navigating a patchwork of policies. Joining Federal Drive host Terry Gerton earlier to walk us through the details is Zach Prince, a partner at Haynes Boone.
The rules around protecting controlled unclassified information, or CUI, they've been in flux for quite a while. They're the bane of lots of people's existence. What is the current state of play there before we jump into some changes?
Sure. So all agencies were supposed to have begun the process of rolling out a program to protect controlled unclassified information starting in 2010. The only agency that has done this somewhat successfully and coherently has been DoD. They rolled out a rule in 2016 that then evolved into the CMMC program that institutes controls required under one of the NIST standards, 800-171. But other agencies have sort of done this in a hodgepodge way of some agencies mandating compliance with certain agency requirements internally, some pointing to other NIST standards. It's been challenging to implement for any contractor. So the FAR Council finally last year, at the very beginning of January 2025, put out a proposed rule that would implement a government-wide CUI program for other than DoD agencies.
And now CUI is getting sort of top billing on the revolutionary FAR overhaul rules that came out just at the end of June for review. What are you seeing in these new rules that may or may not match with the old rules?
Yeah, so this is an interesting way to put out this proposed rule, because this is something that we've been waiting for 15 years or 16 years now. That had a proposed rule that came out in January of last year and then silence. And then suddenly it comes out as one small part of this much larger revolutionary FAR overhaul process with 30 days to comment. So I noticed it right away. I imagine others who are tuned in did as well, but many who probably aren't as aware of these potential pitfalls maybe didn't. So there happens to be a lot of good stuff buried in here. One of the big problems with any CUI program has been identifying what CUI actually is. The government has done a terrible job on the DoD side of telling contractors when information is actually CUI, and just sort of left it to the contractors to figure it out. Just every contract with DoD has to include the clause that implements their CUI program. And if you have CUI, it applies to you. And if you don't, it doesn't. But you're not told whether you are impacted. The FAR rule is very different. It explicitly provides that contractors are required to safeguard only CUI identified in the standard form that's put out as part of this rulemaking. That includes a requirement from the contracting officer to identify if and how to identify and mark CUI, and that the government's failure to designate CUI with this form might require the contractor or the contracting officer to mod the contract, include the applicable clause, and provide for an equitable adjustment. So very, very different than how things have been going on the DoD side.
And this will presumably create some uniformity across the civilian agencies and the Defense Department as well, right?
That's the hope, although the proposed rule does recognize that agencies may have their own security implementations and that the contract would have to call those out. So I'm hopeful that agencies like Homeland Security in particular, which has implemented a slightly different set of rules, will take heed and just go along with NIST 800-171, like the FAR Council is implementing. That will make life much easier for everybody. But one never knows.
Zach Prince is a partner at Haynes Boone. Well, Zach, speaking of the NIST standards, there's some confusion here because DoD is working at CMMC level 2, but the rules put out a new version, right?
Yeah, they do. So NIST has actually rolled out this revision 3 to 800-171, and now I think it's almost 2 years ago. But it contained some variations from revision 2 that were considered fairly hard to implement and costly. And so DoD issued a class deviation a few years back that said, even though the DFARS implementation says you have to apply whatever version of 800-171 is in effect as of the date the contract's issued, actually we're sticking with revision 2 for now because of the cost and burden of implementing revision 3. Unfortunately, the FAR Council decided they're just going to go with revision 3. I've been telling clients for at least a year or two now that revision 3 is probably coming and everyone should be thinking about it. But a lot of companies haven't, and especially because CMMC has been implementing revision 2. Again, for now, I do think revision 3 is coming out on the DoD side at some point too.
So how big of a challenge is that going to be for companies who might operate in both sectors, in the civilian side and the DoD side?
Well, if you're compliant with revision 3, then you're compliant with revision 2. I don't think there's any real argument to the contrary there. But the challenge is just going to be figuring out exactly what additional standards you need to be meeting to get to revision 3 compliance to meet the FAR requirements. So even more money, more confusion, and more time, which contractors really don't have the resources to invest in at the moment. But unfortunately, they're going to have to.
One of the questions that had been hanging around for a while was the responsibility of primes to flow these requirements down to their subs. Does this new rule address some of that concern? Yeah,
it does give the primes a little bit more leeway in figuring out how and to the extent to which they're going to flow the requirements down. And the primes really do have to do some thinking about whether there is CUI involved in their subcontract performance, not just at the prime level. They really ought to have always been doing that, even on the DoD side. But the DoD, the DFARS clauses really do just mandate flow down. And that's how most primes have been doing it, not doing very much thinking of their own of, do we really have CUI involved in performance of these contracts?
It also draws clear lines around what is out of scope, including what data the contractor may have that is not specifically related to their contract.
Yeah, it does. And one point that I thought was interesting, and it might be a little bit wonky, but it expressly provides that an out-of-scope asset would include an endpoint hosting a virtual desktop infrastructure client configured to prevent transmission of CUI beyond the keyboard, video, or mouse. So basically what that means is if you've got a computer that connects through a virtual desktop infrastructure, a VPN, to a cloud-based resource. Basically, my desktop at home that dials into our firm infrastructure. That is, the firm infrastructure might be permitted to house CUI. My laptop or desktop has not been assessed. It doesn't need to be assessed so long as that VPN is sufficiently firewalled so that data can't escape.
That seems like a response to perhaps some industry feedback from earlier. And another place where it looks like they took some industry comment is around the reporting window, right? Now it's 72 hours if you find an incident.
Yeah, that was one of the issues that gave industry a lot of pause when we talked about the proposed rule that came out back at the beginning of 2025. The proposed rule initially had an 8-hour window. And it wasn't just for confirmed cyber incidents. It was also suspected cyber incidents. So that is a really tight turnaround, particularly given the 72 hours that you have in the DoD side. So you'd have to have different response timelines, and you wouldn't have the time to really think about, was this even a cyber incident? Was anything compromised? Could anything been compromised? To meet the reporting requirements, you just have to say, hey, raising your hand, we've got a problem, we think maybe, and we'll tell you eventually what it is.
Zach Prince is a partner at Haynes Boone. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.